Hello, and welcome to this office hour for the Earned Admissions Macroeconomic Principles class at ASU. I'm your professor, Bart Hobijn, and today, let me adjust my camera for a second a little. There you are. Today we're going to talk through basically the final part of the course because you're about ready to take the final exam. So what I'm going to do today is quickly talk about the final exam, and then I want to really emphasize to you that I want you to think about building a narrative. This course has a lot of material, but we live in a world in which information is coming at you very fast. So one of the things you learn in this course is to really understand how you would actually process information. That's one of the things beyond the macroeconomics that you'll learn. So I want to emphasize, kind of give you some hints about how do you absorb the sheer amount of knowledge that we've covered in this class. And that's just something, even if there's some parts where you have worked harder on than others, I think this will help you kind of fill in some of those gaps and also identify what you know well and what you can improve. So that's what I'll do today in terms of conceptually, and then I'll talk you through kind of a broad narrative of all the parts of the course that are covered in the final exam. That's parts 4.1 through 7.1. I'll emphasize a little bit more 7.1 because I know you're working on that at the moment, so you probably are going through some of those exercises in more detail. So I'll show 3 parts of 7.1 that are kind of, things that students tend to struggle with. So I'll shine my light on it, and hopefully that helps you understand it when you go through it. So yeah, there we are. And then you're going to have to study for the final exam, do the final exam, and you reach the finish line. I hope that, if you're hanging in there and you're seeing this office hour, I hope you have enjoyed this class so far. You are the selected sample of people who stuck with this course. I know it's a lot, but I enjoy teaching it. I hope you also see that we've enjoyed preparing this course for you, and hopefully at the end you'll close this course down to the final exam. I think you've learned a whole bunch of stuff that gives you a new perspective on what goes on in the world around you, because it allows you to shine a more of an economics-focused light on things. Okay, so there we are. Let's go. I will disappear and show you some of the particular elements of the course that we're going to go over. One thing, yeah. So the first thing I want to go over with you is I want to talk you through the information about the final exam. So if you go to course final exam overview, you see the information. The exam will open a week from now. Today is February 19th, and it will close on March 5th. So you have a week to complete, a little bit more even than a week to complete this exam. Oh no, I forget that February only has 28 days. Okay, so you have 7 days to complete the exam. As you can see, just read through this information. I'm not going to talk through every single detail of these things, but I would strongly advise you to browse through these parts. I want to also emphasize that the final exam, contrary to the midterm, the final exam is actually proctored. So make sure that you test whether the proctoring services that we're using work for you, and if not, get in touch with the technical support for this course, and they will try and help you out as best as they can. So that's on the final exam. You have 3 hours for 40 questions. Our experience is most students don't need that amount of time, but it's good to have it. There's a few more things for the final exam preparation that I think are worthwhile covering. First of all, we have part 7.2 is not really part of the course material. It's a review section. And I really would strongly advise you to go through it. You don't have to know every detail about what's in 7.2, but there's a very useful thing about exam strategy, because every time I teach, I find out that there's students, in this exam, you see all the questions, and then you can decide which ones to do first. So what I'd like you to do is read through the whole exam, decide which questions are easy, do those first, that you know more about, then choose the ones that you're kind of a little uncertain about, and then do the most difficult ones last. What I see a lot, and I've seen this at the PhD level, at the master's level, MBA level, and undergraduate level, is that students tend to go through the exam question by question by question. Then they panic because they find one that's difficult, they get stuck, and that affects their performance in the rest of the class. So in the rest of the exam. So read over the whole exam before you actually start doing it. You have 3 hours, so there's plenty of time. Now, the next thing that I want you to realize is on the exam preparation. As I told you, this is a lot of material. So you need to find a way to kind of weave it all together. And that's why I wanted to talk a little about how you would go about doing that, how you would prepare that. And let me give you some pointers on how to do that, so that over the next 10 days, if you take the exam kind of in the middle of the exam period, you have enough time to prepare for this and review stuff. So in order to do that, let me show you a set of slides that are actually not part of the course material, but that I teach in a lot of classes here in class at the ASU. And the slides are about information extraction. So the real problem that we all face these days in the world is that we have a pile of information coming at us. Think of this big pile of books coming at us, and then we're asked to basically figure out what are the main things that are in here and understand the main things that are in here. So the real issue you face in this class, and deliberately so, we've set it up such that it's a challenge for you and that you're really kind of pushed to the limit in this dimension, is to distill a set of core insights from a pile of information that you're given. Now, this class is no exception. If you get a job later, there's much more information coming at you than you need to do the main parts of your job, and you have to figure out which ones are relevant, which ones are not relevant. So even though this is, particularly relevant for this course, it's not something that's only applicable in this course. And so how do you go about doing that? So before you even start studying for the final exam, think about basically what you really want to do is you want to kind of thinking about how to organize the material in this course. And organizing the material in this course is a lot like organizing your closet. Now, that sounds a little strange, but believe me, it's true. What do you do with your socks? You put them in a drawer. And, if you need a pair of red socks, blue socks, or sports socks, you just sort it out, and then you find the details later. So the socks are kind of less well sorted, and you just put them in there. Now, with other things, you make sure they're easily accessible and they know exactly where they are. These are your expensive pieces of clothing, like your suits if you have a corporate job, or your sneakers if you love to wear sneakers, or your shorts if you just go around campus here at the ASU in Arizona. Whatever is important for you, you put in more easily accessible. Now, that's the same when you have to think about information. You don't need to know every single detail in this class. You can put some stuff in drawers and baskets and leave it there and figure out later on if you really need it on the exam, or if you need it after the class. It's not only about the exam, where you can find it, or kind of have a way to kind of reconstruct it by talking yourself back through it. Now, there's other things that are very important and that you really need to have accessible immediately. The shoes here, the suits, etc., etc. So a closet is basically organized the way a good organized closet is organized in a similar way as you would organize information. You prioritize it. You make sure that the things that are important are easily accessible, and you also have an awareness of what's important. You have an awareness of what you know and what you don't know. And if you realize that you don't know something that's important, you're going to study it. If you don't know some of the details, fine. Yeah, they might be asked on the exam, in which case you might have a slightly lower grade, but it's going to be much less important than forgetting the really essential parts. Now, how do you do this? There's basically 3 things to think about. The first one is actually something that very few students do, but I think that's important, so I'm going to go over that specifically in this office hour, which is you create a structure and a narrative. You just talk yourself through, what was this part about again? Why are we talking? Why did we go through these things? What is the main storyline? And then you prioritize with a strategy. Now, we've given you a lot of practice exercises that, is about stuff that we think is important. And so you'll probably see some of those or closely related ones back on the final exam. So there's other things that with the key concepts that we have at the end of each part that are pointed out for you to make sure to help you prioritize through the course material. And then finally, and most importantly, and that goes back to go through your exam first and figure out which questions are the ones you know and you can easily answer and which ones you don't, is know what you know and know what you don't know. Now, that's not only important in preparing for this exam because it helps you with exam strategy. That's important after this course as well when you go in a workplace and you talk to people. It's okay to tell people when they ask you a question, hey, I know the answer, this is the answer. Or to say, hey, I don't know the answer, but I'm pretty sure I know where to find it, so let me follow up with you. It's okay. This awareness, you can't know everything. I mean, come on, there's more knowledge being generated in a couple of hours now in the world than there was in the Library of Alexandria, and that mankind had documented 2,000 years ago. Information is coming at us really fast, and it's impossible to know everything. So what is your job is really to know what you know and to know what you don't know. And then of the stuff that you don't know which one things you know where to find and which things you know where not to find. Now, on the exam, it's a little bit the same thing, which is know what you know and you can fill in easily. Know that what you don't know for sure, but you have some way to reason through and think about what the right answer is. And then know what you don't know, you can always go back at the end. And of course, it's a multiple choice exam, so you could guess and hopefully you guess right. But do that last. Do the other ones first. So this is something that that might sound trivial, although every time I teach it here at the ASU, this is something that students look at me and they're like, okay, I never really thought about it in such a structured way, and that's why I'm showing it to you in such a structured way. I hope that this helps you in preparing the exam, and what I'm going to do in the rest of this office hour is roughly give you that narrative, like what was actually covered in 4.1 through 7.1. And then I'll go into increasingly in more details to the parts that are closer to 7.1. One way to start with learning about that narrative is to actually revisit part 112 that was in the course for exactly the reason to explain the narrative of the course to you. Now, you don't have to read every single detail of the part, just skim over it, read over it, but it will give you a sense of, okay, what were the main issues that were going to be addressed in this course? So 1125 was about parts, basically was about parts 4.1 and 4.2. So it ends up talking about studying markets, shortcomings of markets, and then in particular it discusses that in the first week of the first part of week 4, we study 4 particular markets with the specific shortcomings. And what are those markets? Those are markets for public and quasi-public goods. Those are markets for knowledge and education, market for healthcare, etc., etc. So you're going to go and think about what are the shortcomings in each of those markets. Tell a little story about what each of those markets have as a shortcoming. And then public goods. The real problem, for example, is that no one really has property rights over it. So tell a little story about why the lack of property rights is a problem and what causes that problem in but causes problems in those markets. Now, what will help you, let me just go through that for a second, go to that part for a second, is each individual part of the course will have a little narrative about it as well. So if you think about part 4.1, you know, it's worthwhile to review some of those things. And so to quickly browse through go through the introduction video, but really think about, I said 4 markets with imperfections, but it's 3. So think about, really have a story about why the market for public goods and services is a market where there's failures. What are the failures in it? And what are the failures in the market for knowledge and ideas? Now, those 2 things have something in common. So what do they have in common, which is non-rivalry and non-excludability? And then what are the problems in the market for healthcare? And how can we think about how to alleviate those problems in the market for healthcare? So teach yourself to tell stories. At the end, that will really help you understand it by going through it in your own words. Now, this is something that doesn't come natural to us. What comes natural to us is to read something, do a problem, read something, do a problem. But actually, the best way to learn this stuff is to really say, okay, how can I sit down and explain to someone what the main point is of this section? So that was the market inefficiencies and public policies, in particular types of markets in the economy. And then in week 4, part 2, there was a very clear narrative. It was about the labor market and unemployment. And the main time series that part was about the unemployment rate. And the real question was this: in our standard theory of the labor market that we looked at in part 3.1, basically, what we had was we basically looked at the labor market where wages immediately adjusted to equate labor demand and labor supply. But in such a market, there can't be unemployment. But unemployment is one of the headline numbers that we look at for the economy. So if you can't understand what causes unemployment, then you're missing an explanation. You're missing a theory of one of the main headline numbers in macroeconomics. So that means we have to think a little bit more in detail beyond the model of what we call the spot labor market, where the labor supply and the labor demand are equated by movements in the wage or movements in the real wage. And instead start thinking about what in the real world is different from that market that causes the existence of unemployment. So that's what we did in part 4.2. So this is the unemployment rate. By the way, currently they just released the number, and there should be a January number. Yeah, it's gone up a little, and we're now at 4%, but it's still very low relative to what it's been historically. And then the question was, what causes unemployment? So we looked at basically 3 things: distortions, rigidities, and frictions. And first we looked at if there's things that move the labor supply into the labor demand curve left or right, in or outwards, like taxation, for example, that makes people, labor income taxes make people work less. Because it's the marginal benefit of working is lower when you have to pay part of your wage back to the government or to the state and local government or to the federal government. That would be an inward shift of the labor supply curve. And what would that do in equilibrium? The same you can ask for if it's more expensive for employers to hire workers, like, for example, having to pay payroll taxes. So we went through those things. We looked at efficiency wages, we looked at other particular types of distortions. But at the end, none of these theories explains why the wage doesn't adjust to equate labor supply and labor demand. So they're all valid reasons why labor supply and labor demand might be shifting relative to what we were talking about before. But none of these theories explain to us why the real wage would not adjust to equate supply and demand. And so none of these can actually explain the existence of unemployment. They can explain why the employment level or the wage is not exactly the way we thought about it in our simple model, but they can't really explain the existence of unemployment. So then in the next section, we looked at rigidities. And in particular, we asked ourselves, can it be, if wages don't adjust immediately, for example, my wages are basically adjusted once a year, and that's true for most people who have salary jobs. So In that case, if wages don't adjust immediately and there's a shortfall in labor demand, can it be true that you temporarily have periods of unemployment? That is true. That can be true, and we showed that in that part using the talk. We looked at wage rigidities. We also showed that these rigidities, in order for unemployment to exist, but not really surpluses in the labor market, what needs to be the case is that, labor shortages, where the supply of labor is less than the demand for labor. Those really we don't observe. Unemployment is not negative. So then the question is, why is it the case that basically it only happens on the unemployment side and not on the labor shortages side, this existence? And one way to think about it is that it's harder to lower wages than it is to raise wages. That's called downward wage rigidities. And we illustrated how that causes unemployment, but it doesn't cause labor shortages. So that's what we did in the part on rigidities. But there's a few puzzling things. If we look at this time series on unemployment in the diagram, what we're seeing is that the average unemployment rate is not zero. So it's not that we're going to periods where the unemployment rate is zero. Even now, when the labor market is really strong in the US, we still have 4% of the labor force being unemployed. That's 1 in every 25 people. So what's going on here? How could it be that unemployment is always positive? If we do the wage rigidity story, then you would expect that unemployment should basically be zero in good times. And so here's where another theory comes in. And it's important to observe that at the flip side of the unemployment rate, it's not only that at any point in time there's always unemployed people. At the same time, there's also always jobs looking for workers. They're known as job openings or vacancies. And so the final thing that we looked at, basically we discussed something called search frictions, discusses how at the same time you can always have some jobs looking for workers and some workers looking for jobs. And the theory of search frictions is meant to allow to explain us the joint existence of unemployment and vacancies. So we looked at that. We looked at it in the concept of a dance floor, but that's basically what we did in part 4 too. So that's a quick narrative of what we did in part 4 too. And then you can fill in the details and go through the material again and think about, okay, does this have to do with wage rigidities? Does this have to do with search frictions? Does this have to do with distortions? Where do some of these things come in? By having a story, it's much easier to understand the detailed concepts because you basically have somewhere to hang them on. And it will really help you studying. So that's the narrative of the labor market. And so let's talk quickly through the other parts. So part 5 on government, and then part 6 on monetary policy. And then I'll do some stuff from part 7 as well to give you some insight on that. Back to the unemployment rate, but we've seen that already, so let's move on. So part 5 is about the government. And it's really about two things. One is how we just account for the government in the circular flow diagram. Basically, how do we account for the 4 flows in and out of the government? Transfers, taxes, government purchases, and government borrowing. Now, even though that's just an accounting exercise, it's important to know exactly kind of what is included in each of those flows. So if you have this framework, and I'm talking about unemployment insurance benefits, you should have a light go on and think about, oh yeah, that was the particular transfers thing that's going from the government back to household. When we talk about spending $3 billion on building a wall on the southern border, whether we should do it or not, I'm not taking a stance on whether we should or should not, but it would be part of government purchases. Now, in order to pay for that wall, the government either has to raise taxes or borrow money. So, thinking through this diagram, really helps you understand kind of place where different things go, and that will help you. So that's basically part 5.1. It's just an accounting, basically part of accounting for public finances. Now, you'd be surprised, I've interacted with plenty of politicians in my life. You'd be surprised how many politicians don't even conceptually understand this. So get this down. It's not hard, but it's important. Now, once you realize this, then you also realize kind of what the government can do in terms of policy options. Every policy option the government has involves either something with taxes, something with transfers or benefits, something with government borrowing, and something with basically spending on government purchases. And in the first part of 5.2, we looked at what particular things could help raise the level of GDP. I mean, in a perfect world, it would raise the growth rate of GDP, but it turns out that it's very hard for the government to really affect the long-run trend path. But it can have positive and negative effects on the level of economic activity. And we discussed how particular types of government purchases, for example, R&D and education, things like that, could potentially help us build human capital, build knowledge that contributes to productivity. But we also discussed how taxes, to some extent, can have an adverse effect because they cause people can have a positive effect if they alleviate externalities. That's known as Pigouvian taxation, but can also have an adverse effect if they reduce the supply of particular goods and services in the economy. Now, we also spoke about government borrowing, and that if the government ends up borrowing a lot of money, then you could get something called crowding out, where the government borrows so much money that raises the interest rate because it raises the demand in the capital market. And the increase in the interest rate basically causes the interest rates for private businesses in the business sector to increase, as well as interest rates for households who want to buy cars or get mortgages. And that will reduce activity in the business and the household sector. And as a result, very excessive government borrowing that affects the interest rate is going to subdue economic activity, or what we call crowd out economic activity in the business and the household sector. And the other thing the government can do is provide transfers. One thing as a student you might think about is student loans, for example, where the government provides below market rate loans to students, for example, Pell Grants, and as a result, that's effectively a transfer, and that's to stimulate people's human capital accumulation, which presumably will help us be more productive in the future. Again, what I just did was say, okay, so part 5.2 was about long-run implications of government policies, and I just took each of these 4 arrows and I've started filling them in with what policy is relevant, what policy works through each of those arrows. And there's plenty of policies that work through, but hopefully now, when you hear about government decisions and government policies, you can ask yourself, is this a proposal that will help long-run economic outcomes? And if so, does it work through taxes, transfers, borrowing, or government purchases? So again, this is where having a structure, having a narrative really helps you to talk through it. And then sorry, I had a glitch with my keyboard. And then the final thing, getting back to the unemployment rate, is, one of the things is when unemployment goes up a lot, and we have a lot of people who want to work but can't work in recessions, there might be substantial costs to business cycles. So the other question, which is the second thing we cover in part 5.2, is how can we think through stabilization policies? Can the government, through the instruments it has, basically those 4 arrows, can the government actually help alleviate the magnitude of business cycles. Now, this is a controversial topic, as you realized from the part, because there's very different opinions about the economists to what extent the government can do that, and then which instruments are best to use. Now, what I deliberately did in preparing this course is not take a stand on that, but instead just give you an overview of, think about conceptually how you could use each of those instruments. So let's think about that again and go back to that diagram. Now, before we do that, I just want to say this is a highly controversial topic. So you'll hear a lot of different opinions about it, but all of those opinions are about what? Taxes, transfers, government purchases, and government borrowing, and their role in how they can be used to stimulate or not stimulate the economy. Okay, there we're back at the unemployment rate. So now let's think through what can the government do when the unemployment rate's going up? There's a shortfall in economic activity. Now, if that shortfall is largely driven by demand in the economy, the government could potentially stimulate demand. How can the government stimulate demand? Well, it could do it in three different ways. It could either demand stuff itself by increasing government spending. Think about building highways or roads. In the Great Depression, a lot of workers were sent to build roads in national parks. There was it's called the New Deal. And even in the 2008 recession, there was an attempt, I'm not saying it was particularly extensive, to increase spending on infrastructure projects and stuff like that. That would be one way of doing it. You increase government purchases. The other way to do it is that you increase transfers. What you do is you give people unemployment insurance benefits, give people money to spend. So if there's a shortfall in demand, you give them money to spend, then demand will go up again. Or what you could do is you could raise demand by lowering people's taxes and basically increasing their after-tax income, their disposable income. Now, this was, for example, done in 2001, and it was also done in 2008 in the recession. Now, all of those things involve the government either getting less revenue or spending more. And in a recession, because people's income goes down anyway, because the employment goes down, revenue for the government tends to go down anyway. So implicitly through the back door, because these four arrows need to add up to zero, it must mean that they all involve the government borrowing more money. And that's what we're seeing in recessions. We tend to see the government run a bigger deficit. And so when you hear about different programs, you can really think about, especially during recessions, you think about different types of programs on that people discuss, but that will happen during the Great Recession and the Great Depression and other recessions. Really think about them this way. Is this something about transfers? Is this something about taxes? Is this something about government purchasing? Is this something about government borrowing? If you get this down, it actually gives you a much easier framework to think through the discussions about government policies. And again, I haven't told you, this is essentially an accounting exercise. I haven't told you what the purpose of the policy is or whether it's right or wrong. Of course, you can ask yourself the question, is this a type of policy that the government is pursuing that I think has the right objective? And if so, is this the type of policy that's most efficiently implementing anything in the pursuit of this objective? But I leave that up to you. Make up your own mind, get an opinion, get an informed opinion. And so that kind of gives you the narrative of part 5. It's not super hard, but it's definitely something that just takes time to settle in. And again, once you have that down, then you have a real conceptual framework to understand discussions about government policies, and you have a real opportunity to become a very informed, opinionated person. And this is America. It's your First Amendment right to have an opinion and say what you think, although it might not always be appreciated. So that's left us with two other parts to cover. Part 6. Now, I do want to say Part 6.1 is there because it's part of a core principles class, and we do ask about it on the final exam, but there's not a whole lot for me to kind of tell you the narrative. There's a couple of things there. One is, the real question for macroeconomists is, why does money matter? That sounds kind of ridiculous, I know, because we all think money is very important in our lives. But really the question is, the bigger question is not, money has a purpose as an accounting unit, but the real question is, if we change the amount of money in the economy, does that have an effect on the amount of output, on the amount of employment, on the amount of consumption, on the amount of investment in the economy? And the core theory that I taught you in the first part of this course would say it has no effect, because what will happen is what matters is the real wage, the real interest rate. And those two things, if I increase the amount of money, the price level will just adjust, and the inflation rate will just adjust, and the real interest rate and the real wage will just stay the same. This insight that the quantity of money in the economy has very little effect on the allocation of basically real resources in the economy, not nominal resources, is known as the classical dichotomy, and it goes back all the way to the 19th century. And so the real question for economists is why does the classical dichotomy fail? Why is liquidity important? And there was a real sense already in the 19th century, when we had a whole bunch of banking crises and stuff, that money is to some extent important, and the access to liquidity is important. And part of the real question then, when we think about money, is through what channels is that important, and then how does the central bank tweak those channels to affect economic activity? So what I wanted to do, because there's, I think 6.1 is kind of self-evident, so go through that yourself. What I really wanted to do is talk through the model on monetary policy, since that was probably the most complicated part in part 6. And again, I'll give you a little narrative. This model is sometimes known as the new Keynesian model. It's a version of an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. For those of you who have seen this before, or in the future see other models of monetary policy, you might also see something called an ISLM model, which is it's a slightly different version of the same thing. So here's that model. So what's happening in this economy? Here's an economy that has one actual mathematical truth that's uncontroversial. If I map something from the vertical axis to the horizontal axis, that mapping goes through the 45-degree line. But let's see what's actually plotted here. What's plotted here is the real interest rate on the vertical axis on the top diagrams, the inflation rate on the vertical axis of the bottom diagrams and the horizontal axis of the right diagrams, and output is plotted on the horizontal axis, on the x-axis of the left diagrams. And this economy has 3 essential curves. It has an aggregate supply curve. It has 4 curves, but one is derived from 2 others. So it has the aggregate supply curve, it has a monetary policy rule, and it has an IS curve. And these 2 blue curves, they add up to this yellow curve, which is known as the aggregate demand curve. So we have a short-run aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping, and why is this upward sloping in the inflation rate? Why do firms, when there's unanticipatedly high inflation, tend to supply more output? And this is because what happens is that if for example, I sell streaming services subscriptions on the internet, my customers might buy an annual subscription, and that annual subscription, they pay for it. It's a fixed price. Now the prices of other streaming services go up, and what they do is they will increasingly stream through my service rather than through the other streaming services, because I'm cheaper and they don't want to pay for other streaming services the higher rates. And as a result, I'm getting, basically, I have to supply them with more goods in result to that. So my supply of goods goes up when there's unanticipated increases in prices in the market that I haven't taken into account by setting my prices, when I set my prices that are fixed for a while. So one of the stories why the short-run angular supply curve is upward sloping is effectively because prices tend to be sticky. There's many other reasons that this could be the case. This is one of the possible explanations. Now, it's important that this short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. If prices were fully flexible in this world, or there are other reasons why the economy is adjusting totally flexibly, then the short-run aggregate supply curve would be vertical, and no matter what the aggregate demand curve is going to do in this model, the amount of output will always be on this vertical line, and there's no movements in output in response to movements in demand. But the only thing it does here is affect the inflation rate. So let's reset that and look at kind of the case that we're looking at, an upward aggregate supply curve. Now, on the demand side, households, when the interest rate goes up, households consume less, they demand less, and they save more. And businesses tend to invest less because the cost, remember, when we looked at businesses and their use of cost of capital, the cost of borrowing money in order to finance investment effectively goes up as well. And so that makes investment less attractive. Now, in an open economy, which you're seeing this week, the other thing that would do is if the interest rate goes up in a country, that makes the currency of that country more attractive to invest in. So the demand for that currency goes up, the currency appreciates. That makes imports cheaper for buyers in the country, and it makes exports more expensive for foreigners who would buy them. Now, exports is what contributes positively to demand. Increase is what contributes negative. Imports is what it contributes negatively to demand. So even through if in an open economy, if the interest rate goes up through the exchange rate effect, demand will be declining in the interest rate. And so this is basically looking at how spending, think of it as total spending in the economy, is declining when the interest rate goes up. And then finally, there's a central bank that moves the interest rate around by buying basically government bonds, government securities in the short-term lending market, the way we discussed that in the part of the Federal Reserve, in response to the inflation rate. And this is known as the monetary policy. Now, in reality, the central bank takes a lot more into account than only inflation. For example, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, namely price stability. You can interpret that, and they do, as a 2% inflation rate, as well as maximum unemployment. So they would also look at other indicators. But let's keep our life simple and say the central bank only focuses on inflation. For example, the ECB only has inflation. The ECB is the European Central Bank, only has inflation in its objective. So here's our economy. So those two curves determine the shape of the aggregate demand curve. If the central bank changes its response to a change in the inflation rate, that moves the slope of the aggregate demand curve around. The same thing is if households and businesses get more or less responsive to the interest rate, that moves the shape of the aggregate demand curve around. Now, these are shocks. Shocks are the ones that shift these three curves. So notice that when I say demand curve, you might think this is a shift in aggregate demand curve, but it's actually a shift in the IS curve, in the spending curve. You move the spending curve up and down, and the aggregate demand curve goes up and down. So let's think about a recession that's driven by a demand shock. Demand in the economy for goods and services falls. That results in a decline in output, as well as a decline in the inflation rate. Now, what can the central bank do in order to reduce the decline in output and reduce the decline in the inflation rate? What it can do is it can shift the real interest rate it sets at the current inflation rate. So it can, in this case, basically put more money in the economy. And it basically allows, by putting more money in the economy, it allows for more inflation. It basically reduces the value of money in the economy. But by doing so, and it, by doing so, it actually stimulates the total amount of output in the economy, because what it's done, let's look at what it really did. By allowing for more inflation in the economy at the same interest rate, it's actually lowering the interest rate. You see that? So it's shifting the money supply out, it's creating some inflation, but with the same amount of inflation, it's basically also charging a lower interest rate. And by setting the lower interest rate, it's moving down this IS curve that it shifted inwards, and basically stimulating demand by charging a lower interest rate. But it is, of course, creating higher inflation, but that's exactly what you see. It's just moving the aggregate demand curve back along the aggregate supply curve. So what the central bank does, let me just reset the shock so that we're back to the initial bank. What the central bank really does is it stimulates aggregate demand by making borrowing cheaper in this simple model. Now, there's other things that lower interest rates will do. For example, if you want to have a job and you work for a company, often the company pays you before it gets the revenue that's generated by your work. So there's a difference in the timing between the payment of compensation to workers and the receipt of revenue. And banks use basically what they sometimes call working capital loans to borrow money in order to bridge that gap. And the cheaper that money is, the cheaper it is for banks to operate, and that will also stimulate supply. But we are sticking here mainly to the demand type of interpretation. And why is that important? If the economy is driven by demand shocks, if there's demand shocks, look at what happens. I'm just going to move this up and down and up and down. Look at the line that I'm drawing here. I'm basically moving up and down a fixed short-term aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping. So what is this thing saying is that if it's demand shocks that are driving most of economic fluctuations, then higher levels of output should be associated with higher inflation, and lower levels of output should be associated with lower inflation. This is sometimes known as the Phillips curve. In the data, this is not particularly a robust fact, but it's something the central bank focuses on a lot. So that's how monetary policy works in a nutshell, in an ISLM model. Now there are periods in which we have the opposite effect, and here's where monetary policy is a harder term. Remember, monetary policy in the simple world is just moving the aggregate demand curve. Now, suppose there's a supply shock. For example, in the 1970s, the price of oil went up. Now, oil is mainly used, of course, people buy gasoline, what it's used for, but it's largely also causing the cost of producing stuff through the cost of energy to go up. So that makes firms produce less at the same amount. It's what we call a negative productivity shock, effectively. It's causing an inward shift in the aggregate supply curve that's going to make output go down, but inflation go up. And a period like that is sometimes known as a stagflationary period. Now look at if the Fed if the central bank wants to restore the same level of output as we had before, it could do so. It could stimulate demand, but you can see already what happens. Instead of moving back to where we came from, which was about here, it's actually moving further and further away and causing further higher inflation. In the 1970s, that's, by the way, what we saw. We've seen very high inflation rates, not only in the United States, but in most other industrialized countries. Okay, so that was kind of a review of this is probably the most complicated thing in terms of theory that you saw in this part in preparation for the final exam. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about is the part on trade. And I wanted to show you three things, and then we'll call it a day on this office hour. The first thing to think about is how do we account for trade? And I want to give you a little bit of a current discussion that's going on in terms of the political climate, and kind of give you a sense of why those things are relevant and they apply here. So to do that, let's go back to the browser and show you the course material relevant to this. I wanted to show the flow diagram again. You see, currently, we're in a situation where the government, the US government, has passed laws, a tax cut and some spending increases, because of which it's running a bigger deficit, so it needs to borrow more money. Now, I want you to focus on this, and this is where borrowing from abroad comes in. This is basically the equilibrium in the financial markets. Basically, in order to be equilibrium in the financial markets, these arrows have to add up to zero. So if the government borrows more, and households and firms don't change their behavior, the only way to get this increase in borrowing by the government to work is if we borrow more from abroad. But what we tend to forget is that the flip side of borrowing from abroad is running a trade deficit. So if there's no changes in the behavior of businesses and households in terms of their saving and their investment, then if the government wants to run a bigger deficit and increase government borrowing, it needs to borrow more from abroad. So we have to run a bigger trade deficit. So a policy that basically leaves private savings and investments effectively unchanged, but increases the government deficit and tries to lower the trade deficit, is a policy that's effectively not possible. That's simply, from an accounting point of view, not possible. So I don't want to point my finger at anyone, but I want you to start listening very carefully to what's going on in the news these days and realize that what's being proposed in many ways is exactly this. We run big deficits. We run increasingly big deficits. There's a little bit of an effect of policies on changing on investment and savings, but it's not very big. And then we're going to reduce the trade deficit, so we're going to reduce this arrow. This does not add up. It just doesn't add up. So that was just something to take away. And again, this is done through the national savings identity that we covered in this class. So again, as a macroeconomist, what's great about it is, once you know about macroeconomics, you know that you can't talk about one thing without talking about the other thing. These things need to add up. They all are part of one big bloodstream of the economy that we call the circular flow diagram. That was the first part of part 7. And the second part of part 7 is probably the most important insight. Now, you've seen probably a theory of comparative advantage in a microeconomics class if you've taken that before you took this class. But I did want to show this to you. So these are Adam and Janet, and they are basically, they're baking pies and making pizzas. And in this world, oh, my apologies for that. In this world, they can either do that on their own. If they would do that on their own, they would choose this orange point, the autarky point, which was covered in a previous part, in part 7, when you go through this. So this is optimal if they would do it on their own. So then the question is, can they do better if they would work together? Can they do better than autarky? Now remember that they both like pies and ice cream. So if there's a case in which this green arrow, so what they're going to do is, they are going to start off at autarky, and then they're going to change the number of pies and the number of ice creams that they produce. They have to be on this, what's called the production possibility frontier. And then we're going to ask ourselves the simple question, which is, can they be better off if they work together and just share the extra number of pies and the extra number of ice cream they produce by working together rather than working separately? Why is this an important question to ask? Because this is exactly about trade. I do economics, my barber does haircuts, I might not go there frequently enough. That's a different story. And through money, we basically trade the value of our goods and services, and it allows us to buy stuff from other people who specialize in other things. Specialization, the idea of specialization, increases the well-being of people in the economy, is an extremely important insight in economics. We're showing this with Adam and Janet, but think about this as between countries. You know, the French are good at making wine, probably not so good at making cars, except for some people who like French cars. But the Japanese are good at making cars. They're not so good at making wine. So, but they trade these two things between the two countries because people do what they're relatively best at. Why is this important? Why is this good? And why, if you cut off the possibility of this trade and the trade effectively this working together, why does that reduce welfare in the economy? Now, that doesn't mean, so as an economist, we think that trade is in principle a good thing. That doesn't mean in practice, in the real world, there aren't people who suffer from trade. On average, trade is good across people, but some people will reap the benefits more than others, and some people will incur a cost. So this is a broad conceptual way of thinking about trade. In practice, in the real world, there's more of an unequal impact of trade. But I think it's most important to think fundamentally, trade's a good thing. And so the way to think about this here in this example is, if Adam and Janet work together and then they basically share, or think of it as they trade the pizzas and the pies, the ice cream, the pies that they make, can they be better off? And the answer to that is yes. And so we could move, you see, the essential thing is this. I look at kind of how good Adam is at pies relative to how good he is at ice cream. And I'm going to ask myself, if Adam sacrifices making a pie, how much more ice cream can I make? And that's actually quite a lot. So I'm going to say, Adam, for every pie that I sacrifice that Adam doesn't produce, he actually makes quite a lot of ice cream based on the slope here. And then I'm going to say, for Janet, if Janet now offsets the pies that Adam doesn't make anymore and starts making more pies, how much ice cream does she lose in production? And it's much less than Adam gains. So that's basically the slope of this curve. So I'm going to have Janet produce a little bit more of the pies that Adam was not producing now anymore. And so what happens is that all of a sudden this green arrow, which is hard to see, but it's there, is pointing to the upper right, saying that in this case, they both get more when they're trading than when they're not trading. And that's shown by their index, their happiness index, that starts at 100, now being above 100. What did I just argue? I said, because the slope in Adam's diagram is steeper going than of the production possibility frontier than in Janet's diagram, reducing pie production in Adam is giving us more ice cream per hour per pie not produced at Adam's side than the amount of ice cream that Janet sacrifices when she produces a pie more. So we're basically saying on net, an hour sacrificed in pie, a pie sacrifice, sorry, not an hour, a pie sacrificed in production in Janet is giving us well, let me rephrase it. On an extra pie produced for Janet, which is the sacrificed ice cream from an extra pie produced in Janet's case, is less than the extra pies we obtain by reducing the production of, the extra ice cream obtained when we reduce the production of a pie in Adam's case. So this is comparing relative slopes, and that's the most important thing here. I am not talking about where these people are, who's better or not. You see, in this case, Janet is better at anything. But still, Adam should specialize a little in producing ice cream, and Janet specializes a little more in producing pies, even though she's better at anything. So there's a couple of important insights here. This is all about relative ability levels, right? It's about the slopes of production possibility frontiers. A couple of simple lessons from this thing that I think you should take away from it. You will probably meet people, I meet people, and they think, okay, I'm better at anything. So they start doing everything when they work with people in a team. They want to do everything because they think they're better at everything. Remember what this diagram just showed you. No, even if you're better at everything, don't do everything. Delegate the things that you're relatively worse at to other people and do the stuff that you're relatively better at. Remember, the levels of that production possibility frontier didn't matter. It was all about the slopes. Now, I can tell you this from my own career experience. You see this everywhere in every workplace, that people feel like, oh, I'm better than these people. I can do this myself. But that's actually not the right approach. So now, what this means for countries clearly is, some countries are more, the US is more productive in producing almost anything except maybe cars and some manufacturing goods than most other countries. But that doesn't mean the US should produce everything in the world. And again, specialization is a natural outcome. Specialization across countries is trade. And once we start trading, then there's something that determines what the price of a dollar is, which is, goods are, is basically, once we start trading, there's going to be relative demand for dollars versus yen, depending on how many goods we buy in dollars and how many goods we buy from Japan that we pay for in yen. And that determines the exchange rate. So that's the final thing I wanted to talk about in this part. And it's something you're probably working on this week, which is about exchange rate diagrams. These diagrams, by the way, drive me crazy, but there's no other way to present them. So this is the diagram for the market for dollars and pesos. Now, I've plotted the price here as the pesos I pay per dollar, and I called that the exchange rate. The dollar that I pay per pesos is the same exchange rate. It's just a flipped version of it. So depending on whether you live in Mexico or in the US, you might draw this diagram the other way around. So let me talk you quickly through this diagram, then read through the material. The material is very good. It's actually taken from an open source textbook that is excellent. It's a little voluminous. There's a lot in it, but I think that's important. So I'll talk you through the exchange rate diagram, and then I'll quickly tell you the other gist of the material. So the demand here is, if the number of people who want to convert pesos to dollars if the number of people that want to convert pesos to dollars goes up, then the demand for dollars actually goes up. And the dollar gets more expensive than relative to pesos. So I'm paying more pesos for a dollar. If a lot of people want to exchange pesos into dollars, then the supply of pesos basically goes up, but the demand for dollars goes up. And this is in terms of dollar demand. And so people show up, everyone wants to exchange their pesos for dollars, but there's only a relatively fixed amount of dollars. So they're bidding up how much they're willing to pay per dollar, and that's going to cause the amount of pesos per dollar to be paid to go up. What does that mean? This is a little confusing sometimes, but in this case, this means the dollar appreciates. It gets more expensive in terms of other currencies, and the peso depreciates. The only way to learn this, as you can hear from me explaining this, I have taught this about 25 times in my life. And then, of course, I've also tried to learn it as a student. The only way to get these diagrams right is to talk through them. They're not necessarily intuitive, but once you get the hang of them, you understand them better. So this is not something you learn by heart. It's something you reason through. But the most confusing thing about this thing is just a couple of things about this. is one, if you plot it like this, an appreciation of the dollar, appreciation is actually an increase in this exchange rate. But an appreciation also means the dollar gets stronger in kind of rough terminology. That's what people use for an appreciation. And so, again, that means an increase in the exchange rate if we define it like this. Now, other people define the exchange rate as the dollar per pesos, and then it goes the other way around. So talk this through this. If you think about it this way, it's a depreciation of the pesos, but at the same time, it's an increase in the exchange rate the way we've defined it here. So you can define this diagram one way or the other. What I want you to do is to kind of talk through these things. What does a demand shift mean? What does a supply shift mean? The text is filled with examples, but the only way to do this is to kind of put your own words on it. So I tried to do that here. That's the way to understand it. And the final thing I wanted to say about this, the exchange rate part, is there's an extensive part that I think is important and that often tends to be forgotten. Is if we say a strong dollar, that is, the dollar appreciates against other currencies, that actually has an implicitly, remember normative versus positive statements, has a very normative tone to it, that a strong dollar is good. What this section on trade will explain to you is that that's not the case. Some people benefit from a strong dollar, some people suffer under a strong dollar. If I sell goods to abroad and the dollar goes up, then my goods become more expensive in terms of the currencies abroad. Now, if I make money in dollars, the dollar appreciates versus the euro, then the money I make while working here in the United States is worth more in Europe. So visiting my family becomes effectively cheaper. So people benefit from that in other ways. So a strong dollar is not necessarily good for everyone. So then also think about strong dollar policies, which some people are advocating. That actually is kind of a very strange thing to advocate if you don't really advocate why the amount of people and the benefits of a strong dollar are higher than the costs. And most people just think that a strong dollar must only have benefits because it's strong, and strong means good. So a large part of this section goes over the fact that, don't get confused by something that has an implicit normative name to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's always a good thing. So, okay, that wraps up this office hour. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you do well on the exam. Let me check one thing, whether there's any questions related to this from other students who are watching. No, I think I've answered the ones that were here. So then we're all set. I really hope you take this office hour into account when you prepare for the final. Don't get overwhelmed by the amount of material. Once you start putting a narrative on top, it's much easier to understand the details that are underneath it. So good luck on the final. I really enjoyed teaching this class, and well, hope to see you maybe on campus here at ASU or somewhere. I hope that you benefit from applying this knowledge afterwards. If it's not in a classroom, if it's not towards a degree, then I'm sure that getting some of the main insights right about economics will help you in your real life. Bye.